Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Heavy Pen Podcast. Welcome to episode 2, the first episode where we actually talk about the things we're supposed to be talking about as opposed to yapping for an indeterminate amount of time about general concepts. I, as always, am your host, Christian I didn't really think through how to do each of these intros, but yep, I'm your host. It is me, Christian, and I am once again here alone in a room talking to you today about the art of storytelling and what it means to engage with it responsibly. Today, we'll be getting into the kind of the nuts and bolts, the science and history of this cool thing that we can do, why it's cool, and how it affects the brain and all of that. This is, a very fact-based what is storytelling episode. Yeah, I think that's all the introduction, so let's just jump straight into it. So, how are we going to go about this today? Well, first, you may be happy to know, we're actually going to have a little bit of a structure to today's episode because that's the easiest way to get through all of this information in a timely and kind of comprehensive manner. We've got a few sections. We're going to go over some different things. We will be starting with what science says about storytelling and its effects on our brains and psychology, as it were. Then we will go from there. We'll jump into history, just like examples of how these things have happened out in history, and then we'll jump to some contemporary examples. Just talking about what the science says, how it's been done in history, and then we'll look at today how we're approaching all of these things, and we will spend some time really leaning into how we approach it today in our modern world. So, without further ado, let's jump into the science. So, the science of consuming stories. Stories, in this context, we will be defining as any given narrative, whether that is Lord of the Rings or your best friend's recounting of the time he went out to get a burger. What is the science of consuming these things? Well, if we just kind of shave off everything I just said and focus specifically on reading or just consuming information flat out, this is a very well documented thing. When we see things, when we consume them, we are forming memories. The interesting thing about specifically storytelling is that when we are consuming a narrative, there's this process called neural coupling. Hold on, I have an article pulled up over here by the Neuro Leadership Institute. Says, and I quote, "When we see or hear a story, the neurons in our brain fire in the same patterns as the speakers, a process known as neural coupling," end quote. And this, these are all very big words that, you may or may not have heard before, but the actual concept is pretty straightforward. For the most part, we, as humans, have an imagination. The function of our brain which lets us create scenarios and envision things that don't actually exist. So when we are consuming a narrative, that part of our brain is being activated. Our brain is generating the scenarios that we are hearing about or consuming and kind of firing off. There's a little bit of contention in the research about whether it is firing off the same areas in the same way, but it is generally understood that when you hear a story about, Sir Reginald walking down a trail, the parts of your brain that activate while you're hearing that are not just the ones forming the memory of the story, but you are also forming quote-unquote memories of the actual thing that you're being told. And I think that we all kind of understand this on an implicit level. So, think about the last... I was going to say think about the last book that you read, but not a lot of people read books. But let's think about the last book you read, the last story you heard, even the last, movie that you watched. I'm sorry, I'm tripping over my words. Imagine the last piece of media that you consumed that had some sort of narrative to it. So not just saying something happened, specifically a story that you were told or that you consumed. Now, think about the memory that you're kind of like rolling over. Do you remember the experience of where you were hearing the story? Probably. The interesting thing is, do you remember the story as if it were being told to you or as if you were kind of somewhat experiencing it? And that's, once again, it's a little bit of a weird question to ask because obviously, I remember sitting on the couch reading a book, but also you remember the book itself. You remember the words, you remember the scene, not in the same way as if you were just reading the text on the page. You could probably rewrite a story that you were told, but you're not remembering, oh, yeah, just words, or oh, yeah, just the image on a screen. You have you have the connection to whatever it was that you were being told, whatever it was that you were experiencing, and that connection translates into your brain. Like, your brain literally goes through kind of ghost sensations. I believe, not according to this article, but another one in Psychology Today, the PhD who was writing it, she mentioned it was something similar to empathy. You, quote unquote, empathize the situation that you were told. So you have a feeling that you were there, have a feeling that you did the thing. Obviously, it is not perfect. Obviously, it's not, oh, if I tell you about this thing that happened, you do not have the same experience. But your brain does generate similar things. It's a huge part of how we, connect to people, how we learn to empathize, especially as young children. Those stories and the things that we hear people talk about really do affect how we develop the ability to connect, and like to the level where we will just kind of generate emotions in response to the stories that we hear in the same way that we would have, or in the same way we would have had we experienced the event physically. Obviously, the experience is different, but the way that the brain fires in relation to the experience is very, very, very similar, which is super, super cool, if you ask me, which you kind of did. You came all the way here. That's kind of like a very brief overview of the science of reading. I'll be putting the articles that I am referencing into the description of each of these episodes, both to cite my work and to give you something to look at. It's very, very cool, kind of diving into the neuroscience of how stories affect us, because, they do a lot more than I think we really think about. Like, you don't think about watching a movie as, like, to use a bad analogy, like entering the Matrix, as it were. Like, you don't feel like you're going through the screen and experiencing all the things. But the way that your brain kind of processes these things is really similar to that. And I think that that's very, very cool. And as a writer, as someone who engages in storytelling, it's something that we should be pretty conscious of, because we are literally creating experiences in the minds of other people. It's not just, oh, we're writing this story down and it exists in its own vacuum that people can peer into. No, when people are engaging with the things we make, we are literally putting those experiences into their head in one way or another. And like I said, there's some contention in the exact way that this happens, but we all, to some degree, and I cannot speak today, but there's some contention, of course, to like the exact way that this forms, but we do all, to some degree, kind of implicitly understand this concept of when we consume stories, when we consume narratives, we are kind of taking a little bit of like the burden, the effect of those stories into ourselves kind of physically. You've probably heard the epithet, not epithet. You've probably heard the saying, be careful what you consume. And well, there are very, very physical reasons for that. Like, what you consume affects you very, very deeply. And it's very, very cool. And something to be aware of when you are consuming and creating. That's a brief overview of like just the science of consuming narratives. Sort of a general overview of the idea that when we consume, our brains are kind of creating these ghost experiences that we then just have in ourselves and affect us. But let's cut a little bit deeper. Let's talk about memory. Going back to the Neuroleadership Institute article that I mentioned earlier, we mentioned the concept of neural coupling, how our brains will kind of pattern themselves in a similar fashion to the person telling the story as we are kind of receiving it. That's not the only thing that happens when we are kind of processing these narratives. Back to the article, we're going to do another quote. So, quote, "That's why when we experience an emotionally charged event or hear a story of the same nature, certain parts of our brain release excess dopamine, making it easier to remember something with greater accuracy." End quote. So, what does that mean? Well, that's coming right off the heels of the section talking about the neural coupling and how the brain's activating the same areas that it would if you were performing the actions that you were hearing. And then it mentions how it releases dopamine, and then we get into the quote that we just mentioned. So, as your brain is hearing these stories, one of the reasons that our brain loves narratives is because they're compact, they're concise, and they help us remember a lot of information, but in like neat little chunks that have a lot of the fluff of life cut out. There's this quote, I think it's by Shakespeare, who says, "Drama is just life with the boring bits cut out." That might not be Shakespeare, but I have seen that quote. And that's, pretty on the nose. Or not on the nose, on the point. Our brains love efficiency. You could see examples of that all over the place. If you've done any neuroscience, you'll see how your brain is always trying to save as much energy as possible so that you can have the extra to waste sitting on your phone. You need all that time for Subway Surfers, I promise. So I've just spent a couple minutes kind of ping-ponging around the general concepts of how our brains love efficiency. Stories package information in neat little bite-sized chunks, which are coupled with the emotional involvement of whatever the story is. So what does that have to do with anything? I mentioned memory. I've been mentioning emotion. So let's kind of like connect those two things and give you a concrete example of what I'm talking about. As a child, obviously this is probably not a universal experience, but as my target audience is America, I think the majority of us have heard the story of the boy who cried wolf, or at least some variation on that story. Classic children's tale about the shepherd boy who was super, super bored, wanted to stir the pot, so he went running through the streets yelling, "Oh no, there's a wolf," 3 times, and it was a lie, and people were like, "Oh my gosh, this kid." So then, when he did shout, "Oh gosh, there's a wolf," the 4th time, nobody came to save him, and he got eaten. What does that have to do with everything I just said? Well, if you heard that story as a child, you probably remembered it for a very long time. You probably still remember it. What was the point of that story? The point of that story was to kind of communicate to young kids, hey, don't raise an alarm for no reason. Don't make noise if there's not a purpose, because if you keep doing that, no one's going to listen to you. Now, you could just say that to a kid and, hope that they understand it, but that misses out on the importance of the information that you're conveying, which is why it's coupled with this cautionary tale, a story that's supposed to convey some sort of meaning, and it does so by giving a character the lack of whatever trait it's saying that you need to have, and then showing some sort of cataclysm. The Boy Who Cried Wolf is very effective at communicating, hey, don't lie, don't raise false alarms, because eventually you'll actually need that help. And this is how stories really affect memory. You see a ton of these kind of... Hold on, let me see if I can pull anything up. But there's been a very, very interesting ongoing conversation within education about trying to make learning more engaging for students. And one of the methods of doing that that was proposed is kind of just leaning into the narrative aspect of things. There was... I forget what year this was, but a long time ago, there was a version of Minecraft that was the education edition, where it would instead of just the normal game, it packaged a bunch of facts. I think specifically about minerals, I don't quote me on that one specifically, but like, it was to help kind of engage students in the study of one of the sciences. I don't remember what the specific one was. Assassin's Creed also did this. I think it was Origins. I don't actually remember. I remember thinking it was really cool that Assassin's Creed was kind of leaning into the whole education gaming fad. I think I was in like middle school when this happened. I genuinely don't remember. But yeah, like stuff like that. What was I talking about? I was talking about friggin' stories and memory. Right. Video games. Cool. So stories and memory. Stories are great for memory because they are attaching emotion to information, and then they give that to whoever is consuming it. And the emotion is what makes the information so memorable. It's what locks you in to, whatever you're thinking about. I mentioned a little bit ago in this episode when we were talking specifically about like the neurological effects, how your brain creates memories as if you were kind of there. When you're remembering a story, you're not remembering, oh, I'm watching, the screen of whatever it's on. You are remembering the feeling of all the things happening. If you were reading a book or like a comic, you don't remember like the words or the still images. You remember motion, you remember feeling, you remember the tactile information that the author was putting into that story. And that's true beyond just fiction. There are tons of people who are super into true crime. I do not understand it, but like one of the things that you get from true crime is like that kind of like creepy, cold feeling of, he was the most handsome man in town, but then he murdered people or whatever the episode you're listening to today is about. But like you're kind of, as you're listening to this, you put yourself in kind of like a fly on the wall situation, or maybe if you're crazy, your brain will kind of like put you in the state of the victim. It's kind of up to the narrator, not necessarily your brain, but like you feel kind of like the fear of this crime that's happened not probably near you, hopefully not near you. If you are listening to a true crime podcast and it's local, why would you do that to yourself? I don't understand it. But like thinking about that, like going back to the feeling part, the reason that our brains latch onto the information presented by narratives is because of the emotion tied up in them. I think I've kind of repeated that point a couple of times, so we are going to move on. But, you kind of now understand, hey, not only is there a like scientific observable thing about how the stories we create are putting experiences into people's heads, those experiences aren't like stuff that people are just going to forget. They will stick with the people who consume whatever you make, and kind of become this memory of a thing that they didn't do, but like they do still feel. They feel a physical, emotional attachment to whatever it is. Like that's why when you're reading Harry Potter, you hate Malfoy and Snape. That's why when you're watching Lord of the Rings, you cry when they all bow to the hobbits after they've all gone through all the stuff. It's because you have kind of had that connection forged to you. I could talk about that forever, and we're gonna move on to the psychology section, kind of the way that it affects our mental development and all of that, before I start talking in circles. But just so you know, it's all very, very cool. You understand that. And okay, before we move on, the thing that I want to kind of like hit very specifically with all of this science that I'm kind of spitting at you, these are all things that you already know. Most of what I have said has included, because I'm bad at speaking English, half-formed, very scientific words. I've quoted some articles, and I've been, had them up besides me while I've been recording. But these are all things that you already know. Like, you don't need me to tell you, oh, yeah, when you're watching a movie, you feel something about the characters on the screen. You don't need me to tell you that when you're reading a book, you feel and see and smell all the things happening. You don't need me to tell you that because you already know. Whether or not you are conscious of the fact that you know that, it's something that you are very keenly aware of. Like, you probably have a story that you're invested in. And let's go all the way out to the extreme. Let's say you don't Let's say you don't read, you don't watch movies, you don't play games, you don't do any of that. Do you watch sports? There's a story for you. Do you follow celebrity figures? There's another story. Like, if you are invested in any kind of narrative of anything, you are forging a physical, emotional connection to that thing, and it affects you. And you know that. Whether or not you, like, are fully conscious of that fact, you do know that, like, you get super depressed when the insert generic football team to maintain my neutrality loses, and you feel excited when insert alternate fictional sports team to maintain my neutrality wins. Like, you know, to mention a specific one, we are all aware of the Philadelphia Eagles. Anytime they win a game, the city of Philadelphia has to go into lockdown. Why is that? It is because people have such a connection to the story of the Eagles, to like this part of their identity. Like, you know, the thing that the Eagles represent, the city, the people behind the team, the dream. Like, we're all, you know, the people who are into that are connected to it. And that connection is strong enough to, I almost knocked my thing over. Cool. Didn't fall. That's great. Anyway, that connection is strong enough to make people literally go insane and burn their city down. And I'm going to move on. We're going to move on to the psychology section now. But I don't want to leave this section without kind of hitting the point on the head like, hey, I used a bunch of words that might make it seem very clinical, but this is stuff that you know, stuff that you have experienced. Whether you think about it or not, if you spend some time, you'll kind of start realizing that you have experienced it. Okay, anyway, that's enough kind of hip-hopping around. We are going to move into psychology now. So, psychology. We've kind of brushed on a bunch of the things already when we were in our intro talking about just the general neuroscience of consuming narratives. So there's not going to be a ton of stuff here. I've already actually kind of mentioned the part about empathy, how while we are... Actually, I don't know if I have mentioned the thing about empathy. I did mention how the fact that our brains really like to remember things that are attached to emotion, and since stories are very good at delivering emotion, packaged with information, that stories are very good for conveying things that you want people to know. Stories are also a very, very common and powerful tool for development. Which, I'm sorry, I keep losing my train of thought. Essentially what I am saying when I mean like, oh, it's a great tool for development. When we engage with stories, we are witnessing people who may or may not be real, depending on whatever you're reading, go through struggles, go through whatever, and achieve some end point, because, you know, every story ends with a period. That process of kind of witnessing that happen activates the neurons in our brains. I believe the specific thing that was mentioned in this, it was a video by the BBC, which I will also link. The mirror neuron system activates when we are... They specifically talk about fiction, and I really... all right, we're gonna tangent just a tiny bit off of the specific psychology point. I really dislike the hard lining between fiction and nonfiction, because I just feel like the way we do it causes a lot more harm than good. Because, like, you know, the BBC video and these articles that I'm referencing, for the most part, they are all specifically talking about fiction. And yes, everything they say about fiction is true. However, this is also true for nonfiction stories. And that's the entire thing. Like, I appreciate that they're specifically pointing out that fiction works this way, but this also works for like a nonfiction story. Like, if you read the historical account of Anne Frank, you would go through the same things as if you read a fictional version of that story. There's this book. What is this book? The Boy in the Alamo. It is a fiction. It's a historical fiction book about a kid who goes to the Alamo. You still, like, because it is closer to reality doesn't mean that it affects you less or necessarily that differently. And yes, everything that can get a little muddy depending on what the nonfiction is. Like, if you're reading a cookbook, you are probably not being engaged in the same way if you were reading like someone's memoir. Yes, but a cookbook is typically not a story, and we're just talking about stories in general. That's that entire tangent. Back to the point of psychology. When we are going through stories, we are empathizing with the characters. Empathizing specifically, hold on, let me pull up the definition of empathy, because those are words we've kind of ruined. So empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings of another person, which is different from sympathy, which is just the understanding part. So when you're reading a book, you are directly empathizing, not reading a book, consuming a story. Forgive me, I will say, I'm probably going to say read a book a lot, and there will be points where we talk specifically about reading. But right now, I'm aiming for more general just storytelling as a concept. So if I trip up and say reading a book, and I was not specifically talking about reading a book, I probably meant to say telling a story. That's just me. I'm going to do my best to avoid that, but just so we know. Anyhow, empathy. When you are consuming a story that involves characters, you are directly empathizing with those characters by virtue of the fact that you are in a position where you understand these characters on a level that you could not typically understand another person. You're in their head, you are hearing their thoughts, feeling their feelings, so you are getting that direct connection in a way that like you just typically would not if you're just going around day by day. It takes a lot of effort to, in your everyday life, consciously be aware of how other people might be feeling and that be done healthily. A lot of people do it and it's not super healthy. But when you're consuming a story, it's just kind of there and you don't have to worry about it. That's really good for building empathy because you are living outside of yourself and kind of dealing with the emotions of this other person. Am I saying that if you just read Harry Potter 7 times, you'll become a more empathetic person? No, that's not what I'm saying. I am saying, however, it is something that can help to build your empathy by virtue of you are living outside of yourself and it kind of works those muscles in the brain. There are a lot of very cool things about like how storytelling can affect your mood and stuff like that, but we know this. I do not currently have a specific article in front of me because I misplaced it. The Psychology Today article is a really, really nice kind of bird's eye view. But, you know, definitely lean into, if you're curious at all of any of the things I said and you want to elaborate more. Well, first off, you can just tell me that and maybe I'll like make a follow-up episode where we kind of dive deep into something that I gloss over. This episode is very much kind of another bird's eye view type thing, which I know for me personally, when I am listening to a podcast or watching like a video essay or something and they kind of bird's eye view over things, I really love diving into things. So sometimes bird's eye view is not super satisfying. So if I bird's eye view over anything and you wanted more from me specifically, you can go ahead and just let me know that. I will also link all of my social media accounts in the descriptions and all of that. But also, I highly encourage you to do your own research. You should never take what someone else says on like the internet or honestly anywhere at complete face value. Do your own research, learn stuff. We're actually going to touch that in a second because I've kind of gone through most everything I want to do in psychology. I kind of went through a lot of it in just the earlier neuroscience things because it's like, hey, when you're reading, the stuff you're reading directly affects you and alters your brain. That's basically the gist of everything I was going to say. So now we're going to move into the history part. We're going to look at like historical examples. And oh boy, are some of the historical examples very, very, very scary. And so they're not all scary. And like, I'm not going to, once again, I said this last episode, I'm going to say it again. This is not a doomsday podcast where it's like, you wield dark and dangerous power and you should feel bad about it. No. I want you to be aware, but you don't need to be afraid. So as we go to the historical stuff, just know this is stuff that happened. It's not all that bad. I have one really bad example from not super long in the past, but in general, this is just, hey, this is how this stuff can be manipulated. I really need to get better at doing my transitions. Anyhow, let's jump into history. So when talking about historical ways that stories have kind of been used to fulfill some purpose. The natural first thing that I thought of, anyway, maybe this wasn't the first thing you thought of, was propaganda. It's pretty straightforward, pretty easy to understand, I think, about how propaganda leverages the power of storytelling for a purpose. But let's look at a specific example. I don't know why my brain just shut down. I have Captain America just written in plain text in front of me, and then I just couldn't read it. You didn't need to know that, but now you do. Anyhow, Captain America and World War II. I don't know that I need to explain it, but we're going to, because that's what you came for. But yeah, Captain America was created during World War II, and you want to know why? He was created to sell war bonds. It's actually a very fun thing in the first Captain America movie that the MCU put out. The beginning of that movie, he's this super soldier who went through this process, and the doctor who was like helping kind of mentor him died and stuff. And he's like, I'm ready to get out there and fight. And then they just have him going on essentially a press tour, just being like, hey guys, you should buy war bonds. That appears to be a tongue-in-cheek reference to what Captain America was originally, which was just a vehicle by which to convince people to buy war bonds. Specifically, comics were used to kind of market the idea of supporting the war effort to kids. Because, hey, how do you get what you need? You attack on all fronts. The United States government needed money to fund the war effort, so they needed to convince people with money to buy war bonds. So how do you do that? Well, you put short films at the beginning of movies. You put up posters everywhere that there is a wall, and you sneak in. Sneak in implies it was subtle. You sell propaganda. You sell advertisements to children. It is the same thing that happens today, just not like there's no war, but we're all familiar with how advertising works. You just throw as many ads in as many directions as possible, and you just kind of wait for the people who get hit by them to eventually decide, all right, fine, this is the 700th time that you've told me to buy war bonds, so fine, I'll buy war bonds. That was what Captain America was for. There's a little bit of, not a little bit of, basically during this period of time, a large amount of the comics industry kind of turned towards having this approach, like having, pro-war sentiments, support the troops and all of that baked into their stories, or not necessarily baked into their stories, but put in places. Like there were covers. There's one, I'm actually sitting in this video from, what's this college? I forget. From Nelson University. It's this, it's not a vlog. It is a lecture that this professor was giving. He has a picture of Batman handing a rifle to a soldier, being like, here you go, soldier, a new gun from the people supporting the Seventh War Loan. That's what it was. Because a bond is when you loan money to the government, and then they pinky promise to pay it back. It's like I'm not going to start talking about finances because I don't care, but I think bonds are a pretty okay thing, but that we're moving on. But yeah, so ways that stories have been used in history: propaganda, stuff like advertising to support the war, Captain America. That name probably, so you've probably kind of been desensitized to the phrase Captain America because it's just a superhero name, in the same way that you've been desensitized to Batman, Robin, Superman. But if you think about any of those things, Captain America, I wonder what he's all about. Captain America and Superman are both, beyond just their kind of support for World War II and America's efforts there, they are just their stories designed to kind of prop up the idea of the American dream. Superman's old catchphrase or slogan or whatever it was. What was it? It was truth, justice, and the American way. Specifically, and the American way. You'll see a lot of people who do dissections of the original Superman of oh yeah, it's this immigrant story of this, kid, this orphan kid who's coming from another place, coming to America, and, getting filled up with all that good American goodness and then going on to become something great. It's the story everybody wanted to live. It really spoke to a lot of, we all know that Superman spoke to a lot of people. He's an icon of just the comic world and superheroes. I think, hold on, let me make sure that I'm not wrong, but I'm like 90% certain that the people who created him were Jewish. The role that Jewish immigrants played in the origins of the comic book market cannot be understated. Superman is an immigrant story. Yeah. Okay, so I'm reading an article from Humanities Washington. I'm going to look back at my microphone so my audio sounds better. But yeah, I cannot find the specific name of the Superman creator, but I think there was two of them. I think they are both Jewish. They are both Jewish immigrants. So that was one thing. That was also pretty cool about Superman. And, kind of connecting back to this idea of Superman as the immigrant story. Another way that the story of, another way that a story, I'm sorry, I got really chewed up, but Superman is another way of a story kind of being used to push ideas forward. Not just about World War II, but about like, hey, immigrants, pretty cool, right? And that's like a thing. Then we've got Captain America. We have basically the entire comic industry. We have Batman doing stuff. But that's like, I don't know why I marked this down in my like outline as stories used in wartime. It was just like a very easy to understand example of like history. But there are like a ton of other things. I keep saying that. There are a ton of other things through history of like how stories have been used to do things. So we talked about propaganda. Let's kind of lean away from, I don't like the word nationalism. We'll lean away from nationalism and towards like something more of a like a civil rights sociology thing. Sociology is definitely the wrong word to use there, but whatever. We're talking about the book Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, before you freak out, Uncle Tom's Cabin has gotten a really weird kind of twisting to its origins. For those of you who do not know, Uncle Tom's Cabin is a book about slavery. It is specifically an abolitionist book, an anti-slavery book, which follows the stories of a couple different people living during the period of slavery and kind of like showcasing the ways that it destroys. It's actually a surprisingly good book. I read it for a class that I took. I forget how long ago this was, but I remember being surprised because I had been kind of told that Uncle Tom was this like horrible racist thing, which was like pro-slavery essentially. That's actually not true. The author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, I forget her name, she actually spoke to Abraham Lincoln, and some people attribute the release of her book to a spark in the kind of later abolitionist movement right before the Civil War actually started, which is crazy. Like, think about that for a second. I know I've kind of like jumped all over the place, but let's kind of regather our mental focus and look at this example from history of a thing that actually happened. This woman, who was living during the Civil War period, wrote a book which got her an audience with President Lincoln and got her a minor credit in what was potentially the start of the Civil War. That thing you all are aware of. The American Civil War, the thing. It's insane. Like, think about that. She wrote a book and might have helped start a war and also helped end slavery in the U.S. Is that not like awesome? It's okay. Awesome might be I just talked about how she may have helped to start the Civil War, and I also just said the word awesome. I'm not saying it's awesome that she may have inadvertently kind of assisted the deaths of so many soldiers, but the thing that's awesome is like this story that she wrote had the power to move a nation. Obviously, she didn't do it by herself. Obviously, she wasn't the only contributing factor, but hey, she did a thing that should not be overlooked. Like, it's that kind of, I just punched my microphone. But yeah, it's that kind of thing that I really want to hammer in here. It's like, the reason that, episode 2 is about the science and history behind storytelling. We spent like 20 plus minutes talking about, okay, how do stories affect your brain, all of that good stuff. And, I just basically just said, hey, you feel stuff when you consume narratives. And then we jump into history. Why did we jump into history? To show what that actually can look like. It can be as simple as you and your friends went out, watched a movie, had a good night, and it can be as groundbreaking as literally helping to end slavery in the U.S. and also sparking one of our most deadly conflicts. Like, that's not something that we should just hand wave. The ability to tell a story effectively is awesome. And I want you guys to be aware of that and think it's very, very cool. But with great power comes great capacity for harm. There are so many examples throughout history of stories being used negatively. Now, nothing as dramatic as, oh, this novel was, specifically engineered behind causing the microplastic crisis. I don't have any examples like that on me right now. I'm certain they exist, but I'm right now just kind of specifically talking about the general concept of storytelling and how it can be used for evil, as it were. And unfortunately, there are a lot of examples of this. I mentioned World War II earlier, how, there's a lot of pro-war propaganda and stuff going on in the U.S. at the time. There was also a lot of other things happening, both in the U.S. and in the world at large. A very good example of this is just the propaganda that was used in Nazi Germany to kind of dehumanize the Jewish population there. Calling them horrible things, labeling them as, not fully human, is a lot of very bad things. And unfortunately, that is also a form of storytelling, the kind of weaving of narratives. It wasn't all just amorphous, oh, be afraid of the Jew. It was also specific stories like, oh, this Jewish person did this thing. And there's another example that I heard about very recently, which is a little bit closer to our present day. Something I imagine a year all of us, I can imagine we remember very well, or at least with some level of clarity. In 2017, the genocide that took place in Myanmar as a result of multiple years of this campaign against the Muslim minority that lived in that country. It's a tragedy. It's a horrific tragedy. And it was made possible by the manipulating of this narrative, by making this group out to be violent, making this group out to be, dangerous, to be out to get them. And then on top of that, the specific creation of these little minor narratives of things that happened, attributing certain crimes to this group of people in order to spark that emotional response from onlookers. I will be linking a video which kind of goes over that entire situation. It's a very, very good video. It's only 24 minutes long, so it's not super, super huge. And it kind of covers the whole situation as, how it unfolded, how it began, and all of that, if you are interested in looking at that. But the reason I bring up, the examples of Nazi Germany and the Myanmar genocide is to, once again, kind of hammer in the point, it's not nothing. The ability to tell stories comes with the ability to use those stories for good or for evil, and being unaware of that doesn't remove you from responsibility. We'll use an example. This is, okay, so we've kind of transcended the discussion of history. We're slowly moving in to kind of contemporary and modern day. So, I don't know. I'll put the transition here. But yeah, so we just got done talking about a ton of the history stuff, and then I almost just went right into, all right, so what does all this mean for today? How do I think we're doing? Well, not well. I talked a little bit about this in episode 1, and I'm going to kind of hammer in this point now. Here, I keep saying hammer in this point. That's not the right thing. I'm going to elaborate, there we go, on what I mean by I don't necessarily think we're doing great. In episode 1, I kind of said the opposite, where it's like, I don't think we're doing that bad. And in truth, we aren't. What I meant when I said we weren't doing that bad is like, we're not on a large scale, creating things with the intention of harming people. However, I do think that we've kind of stopped creating things with the intention of helping them as well. There's this concept, kind of the why do you tell stories? And there's 127 different answers to that question. There's no real right answer, but I do think that it's really, I think it's very, very sad, because I feel like it's the minority of people who are engaging in the craft of creating, who are telling stories, that ask why they're doing it. Like, I'm struggling to put this thought into words, which is kind of funny, because I wasn't expecting to have trouble putting this thought into words, but it's like, okay, to use an example of a story that I think was kind of told with a purpose, going back to the Chronicles of Narnia. If you are unfamiliar, the Chronicles of Narnia is a very, very popular, very well-known kind of allegorical fantasy work by C.S. Lewis. I would be really surprised if you had not at least heard of the Chronicles of Narnia, but hey, not everybody was raised Baptist, so there's the general background. Allegorical fantasy, very well written. C.S. Lewis is a great author. Highly recommend you go check it out if you haven't read it. The Chronicles of Narnia was written with a purpose, and that purpose was to, tell the story of these children who go through this magical fantasy world and yada, 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 but also to, cover themes of Christianity, of Christ's sacrifice, of hope, of redemption, of good versus evil, and all of that. And I think it does a pretty solid job going over all of that. And, the point was to teach to children. Well, I feel like by and large we've kind of stopped doing that. We've moved away from I'm doing this because I want to express this idea, and more towards I'm doing this because it's just a hobby, or it doesn't really matter. I feel like storytellers, creative people, artists, all of that stuff, we've been convinced that our only value is kind of monetary, kind of like very much, will just someone buy it and that's all that matters. Like, I have a story I want to tell, and maybe that story that I want to tell even has a wider point. But by and large, I'm just kind of trying to make something that will sell. And I think that's really sad, because I've spent the last 40 minutes talking about the power that this has. So I think it's really sad to not even really consider the value of whatever you're making beyond whether or not someone will pay for it. And now, again, I have to be careful when I'm doing this, because I don't want to come across as super pessimistic about it. I'm not saying that whenever you engage in any sort of creative pursuit, you have to be like, okay, this thing I'm going to make is going to tell the story of the, I don't know, insert something cool or heart-moving here. I'm not trying to say that, but I am trying to say, when you engage in creation, you should have some sort of, reason to be engaging in that creation. Because regardless of whether or not you think that your words, that your works will mean anything, regardless of whether or not you achieve a ton of fame or not, if someone sees what you've made, it's going to have an effect on them. And I want us to be conscious of that. I'm not saying you have to go out of your way to, be trying to write the next Great Gatsby and make people think. But you should be aware of the fact that, hey, when I'm making something, it matters. When I'm making something, it has the ability to change at least one person's day, and then that change has ripples that go outward. So that's a little bit of a tangent. I was supposed to be talking about, how do we engage with storytelling today? What are the primary ways? And I mentioned how it's very financial, very utilitarian, I believe is the factual word. I kind of no longer want to go over oh yeah, it's all about marketing and money and stuff. 'Cause I don't know, you've all probably had some variant of the conversation which goes, everything that like Hollywood puts out nowadays is just a mindless cash grab, or like, every book that I've read is just trying to capitalize on like the new trend so that they can make money. I'm like, I don't really feel like going over that. So we're going to skip that. We're going to go straight to like just my thoughts on the subject. And it's like, hey, I just spent a long time talking about how, you have to be so conscious of everything. To those of you who disagree with me, or just to those of you who haven't really been thinking about it, like, you're not wrong for not thinking about it. I think that you should think about it, but like, as long as you are being mindful that you're not creating something that is actively harmful, you've kind of done the bare minimum of your due diligence. I want us to do more than the bare minimum of due diligence, which is why I've made this podcast, why I'm talking to you, why I've just spent the last however long talking about history and psychology and neuroscience and all of that. But like, as long as you're doing your base minimum of due diligence, I think that you are at least doing less harm than you might, or, ideally no harm. But I don't know. I've seen so many examples of like things that were made not mindlessly, but like without real thought to everything that goes into them. And it always bothers me because, this is a thing that I'm consuming, and it's become part of me in that way. I have digested this thing. I've read this comic. I've read this book and all of that. And like, just the lack of care that sometimes goes into these things really bothers me. Because like, you created something. Find that cool. Let that be fun. Oh dear. I did not expect to react emotionally so much to this portion of the thing. Also, very happy that I've been able to get as much juice out of this particular lemon as I have. Hold on, I'm going to take a quick sip of water. Water's great. Hot take, I think water's pretty awesome. Okay, I think we're going to kind of start winding down this episode before I make it 3 times as long as it needs to be. So let's just go back over everything we talked about today. We started with just kind of an overview of kind of the neuroscience behind stories, how they affect your brain, why they affect, well, maybe not why, how they affect your brain, the implications of that, and just, the fact that those effects are pretty profound, pretty important, things that we already know implicitly, and to a degree consciously we're aware of this, but, just kind of bringing that back up to the surface. And then we went from that kind of science discussion to another overview of history, talking about like old examples of how stories have been used for specific purposes, like wartime propaganda, in grappling with societal change, or unfortunately things like, I cannot think of a phrase other than hate speech, and that's not because there isn't one. It is simply just the only thing that has ever been kind of put forward for me to mentalize. Picture it with. That was a lot. Okay. Let's try that one more time. Let's just do a quick overview of everything we talked about today. We did a brief overview of the science behind the consumption of stories, talked about how it affects your brain in the same way as if you were physically engaging in those activities that you were kind of consuming, how the emotions inherent to narratives make the information that you're kind of absorbing really stick in your brain, how that affects your psychological development and all that stuff. And then we also did a brief kind of sweeping overview of history and like examples of how that's been done with stuff like comic book wartime propaganda with the creation of Captain America and Superman. And then we've also talked about certain works that like engaged with societal change. Things like Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is the specific work we talked about, that and its relationship to the Civil War, which, oh boy, I can actually see myself doing a full episode on all of that, but that's for the future. And then we kind of ended by talking about how today we think about it very monetarily and not necessarily from the wider implications of, hey, when you create a thing, that thing has a power that we kind of don't fully appreciate anymore. Or at least I feel we don't really appreciate anymore. So that was kind of like a general bubble for the things we did talk about. And I want to end on a positive note and just be like, hey, it's still cool. I've mentioned some things that aren't super awesome, but like for every one voice that says something, evil and tries to create destruction, there is a counterexample. Yeah. So once again, that's been me today. I'm going to go take a breath. I'm going to go take a breath, take a walk outside. You should too. Thank you all so much for listening, and I will see you guys on the next episode. So until then, I hope you have a great rest of your day, night, or whatever time it is, wherever you are. All right. Bye-bye.